Sometimes life takes everything from you before it gives you anything back. Preston Calloway knew that feeling well. At 47, he'd lost his marriage, his job, and nearly his hope. All he had left was Tucker, his loyal dog, and a truck that finally gave out on a quiet Virginia back road. That's when he met Wendell Ashby, an elderly farmer who offered him a meal and later, something unbelievable, his entire farm. Preston thought that gift was the miracle, but it wasn't. The real miracle came months later when his estranged daughter Audrey showed up at the farmhouse door. What could possibly bring a father and daughter back together after years of silence and hurt? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Preston Calloway had been a good man once. Not perfect, never that, but steady. The kind of father who showed up to school, plays even after double shifts at the factory. The kind of husband who remembered anniversaries and fixed the leaking sink without being asked. For 22 years, he'd worked the assembly line at Mitchell Manufacturing, building components for agricultural equipment. His hands knew the rhythm of honest work, the satisfaction of a job completed with care. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago. Brenda had been direct, almost kind about it. "We've been living separate lives for years, Preston. You know it's true." And he did know it, though admitting it felt like swallowing glass. She'd met someone else, a dentist named Roger who lived in Sacramento. By June, Brenda was gone, the house sold, their shared life dismantled and divided with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. Audrey had been 21 then, finishing college in Oregon. She'd taken her mother's side without hesitation, and Preston couldn't blame her. He'd been distant those last few years of the marriage, buried in work, avoiding the slow death of his relationship with Brenda. When Audrey needed him to show up, to fight for the family, he'd simply accepted defeat. She saw it as weakness. Maybe it was. The worst part wasn't losing Brenda. The worst part was losing Audrey. They'd been close once. Preston remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle in the driveway, running alongside her with his hand on the seat until that magical moment when he let go and she kept going, pedaling furiously, laughing with delight. He remembered camping trips where they'd count stars, and she'd ask him questions about everything: why the sky was blue, where the moon went during the day, whether dogs dreamed. He'd answered as best he could, and when he didn't know, he'd say so, and they'd wonder together. But somewhere between her 13th birthday and her 18th, they'd lost that easy connection. Preston had blamed teenage independence, the natural pulling away that all children do. Now he understood it was more than that. He'd stopped asking questions. He'd stopped wondering with her. He'd let work consume him, using overtime as an excuse to avoid the uncomfortable truth that his marriage was failing and he didn't know how to fix it. The real breaking point came a year after the divorce. Audrey had called him excited to announce her engagement to a man named Travis. Preston had met him once. Slick smile, too much cologne, the kind of guy who talked about his ambitions like they were prophecies. Preston had seen the warning signs immediately, the way Travis interrupted Audrey, the subtle put-downs disguised as jokes, the isolation from her friends that Travis called focusing on us. Preston should have voiced his concerns gently, should have asked questions, expressed care, offered support while trusting Audrey to make her own decisions. Instead, he'd said, "You're making a mistake. He's going to hurt you." Audrey had defended Travis, argued that Preston didn't know him, didn't understand their relationship. And Preston, frustrated and frightened for his daughter, had said the words that severed everything. "I'm your father. I know better than you do." She'd hung up on him, stopped answering his calls, blocked his number. 6 months later, mutual friends told him the engagement had ended badly. Travis had been controlling, just as Preston suspected. He'd isolated Audrey, criticized her friends, made her doubt herself. When she finally found the courage to leave, Travis had made it ugly, stalking her social media, showing up at her apartment, forcing her to get a restraining order. Preston had reached out immediately, wanting to help, to comfort, to be there. But his first words, God, why had those been his first words? Were "I told you this would happen." Audrey's response came via text, cold and final. "You don't get to be right and be in my life." Choose one. He'd chosen wrong. He'd chosen pride. He'd let months pass, telling himself she needed space, that she'd come around eventually. But she never did. 3 years of silence followed, a gulf that widened with each passing holiday, each unanswered message, each birthday that went by without contact. The layoff came 8 months ago in January. Mitchell Manufacturing was closing the plant, moving operations overseas. Preston received 6 weeks of severance pay and a handshake from a manager he'd worked beside for 15 years. At 47, with no college degree and a skill set tied to a dying industry, the job market was brutal. He sent out dozens of applications, got 3 interviews, received 0 offers. His savings evaporated. The small apartment he'd rented after the divorce became unaffordable. He sold most of his possessions, packed what remained into his 15-year-old Ford pickup, and made a decision born of desperation and something deeper, a need to be anywhere but where he was. Tucker, the 9-year-old yellow Labrador, was the one remnant of his old life that mattered. Audrey had picked him out as a puppy when she was 15. She'd named him after her favorite character in some book Preston couldn't remember now. When she left for college, Tucker stayed behind. When the divorce happened, Brenda didn't want him, and Audrey was living in a no-pets apartment. So Tucker became Preston's, a living connection to his daughter, even if she no longer wanted that connection herself. Preston pointed the truck west, with no destination in mind, just a vague notion of California, of starting over somewhere the past couldn't find him. He drove through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, avoiding interstates when he could, taking back roads through small towns that looked frozen in time. Tucker rode in the passenger seat, head out the window when the weather was nice, content to go wherever Preston went. They made it as far as Virginia before the truck gave up. Route 29, just south of a town called Crestwood. The radiator overheated in spectacular fashion, steam billowing from under the hood, the temperature gauge buried in the red zone. Preston managed to coast to a gravel pull-off before the engine seized completely. He sat there in the sudden silence, watching the steam dissipate into the late afternoon sky, and felt the full weight of his failures settle on his shoulders. He had $300 in his checking account. Maybe enough to fix the radiator, maybe not. No job prospects. No home, no family. Just an old dog and a dying truck on a road that led nowhere in particular. Tucker whined softly, sensing Preston's distress. Preston scratched behind the dog's ears, the familiar gesture grounding him. "We'll figure it out, boy," he said, though he had no idea how. That's when the old pickup pulled up behind him, and Wendell Ashby stepped out. Wendell was 78 years old, though Preston didn't learn that until later. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had earned its aches, honestly. His face was weathered, deeply lined, the kind of face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He wore faded jeans, a flannel shirt despite the mild spring evening, and work boots that had been resoled more than once. "Radiator?" Wendell asked, nodding toward Preston's truck. "Looks like it," Preston said. Wendell peered under the hood, made a few thoughtful sounds, then straightened. "You're not getting that fixed today. Nothing's open this late, and even if it was, you'd need to let the engine cool overnight." Preston nodded, already calculating whether he could sleep in the truck, what he'd do about food. "There's a motel about 5 miles up," Wendell continued, then paused, studying Preston more carefully. "Or if you'd prefer, I've got a spare room and a hot meal. No charge. Just an old man's hospitality." Preston's first instinct was to refuse. He'd learned to be wary of charity, of obligations disguised as kindness. But something in Wendell's face, a simple, unadorned decency, made him reconsider. "I have a dog," Preston said. Wendell's expression softened. "I like dogs. Bring him along." And so Preston Calloway, carrying nothing but failure and a worn wallet with his daughter's childhood photo inside, followed a stranger down a country road toward a farm that would save his life. 3 weeks passed before Preston's phone rang with the call that would change everything. The days had fallen into a rhythm that surprised him with its ease. Mornings began early. Preston woke with the sun, made coffee, and joined Wendell on the porch to watch the farm come to life. They'd discuss the day's work over their first cups, fence posts that needed replacing, a section of the barn roof that was letting in rain, the garden beds that required clearing before spring planting could begin in earnest. The work was physical and satisfying in a way factory labor had never been. Preston's hands, calloused from years of assembly line repetition, adapted to new tools and tasks. He learned to read the grain of wood before driving a nail, to judge the tension needed in fence wire, to feel when soil was ready for turning. Wendell was a patient teacher, showing rather than telling, correcting mistakes without criticism. The truck had been fixed, a new radiator and 2 new belts, $400 that had nearly emptied Preston's account. But instead of leaving, he'd stayed. Wendell had made the invitation casually, as if it were nothing. No sense rushing off if you've got nowhere particular to be. I could use the help, and you seem to appreciate the quiet. Preston did appreciate the quiet. More than that, he appreciated the purpose. For the first time since the layoff, he woke each day knowing what he was meant to do. The farm didn't care about his age or his lack of a college degree. It only cared whether he showed up and did the work. Tucker thrived in the open space. The old dog seemed to shed years, racing through the pastures, investigating every corner of the property, splashing in the creek that marked the eastern boundary. In the evenings, he'd collapse on the porch, exhausted and content, his graying muzzle resting on Preston's foot while the 2 men talked. Wendell told stories about the farm, about his children playing in the orchard, about Margaret's vegetable garden that had once produced enough to feed half the county, about the challenges of keeping a small farm viable in an age of industrial agriculture. Preston listened and learned, not just about farming, but about the shape of a life well lived, even if imperfectly. Preston had kept his phone turned off for most of those 3 weeks. He checked it occasionally for messages, a few from his old landlord about mail that had arrived after he'd left, one from a former co-worker asking how he was doing. Nothing urgent, nothing he needed to respond to immediately. The phone became just another thing he'd left behind, part of a life that felt increasingly distant. On a Wednesday afternoon, while replacing rotted boards on the front porch, Preston turned the phone on to check the time. He'd left his watch inside and wanted to know if he had time to finish the section before dinner. The phone powered up slowly, and then came the notifications, old texts, a few spam calls, nothing important. And then it rang in his hand. The screen showed a name he'd looked at hundreds of times over the past 3 years, never quite able to delete the contact. Audrey. Preston's heart stopped. His hands were suddenly unsteady, and he nearly dropped the phone. He stared at the screen, watching it ring, paralyzed by the impossibility of the moment. After 3 years of silence, why now? Why today? He answered on the 4th ring, his voice barely above a whisper. Hello, Dad? Audrey's voice was uncertain, careful, as if she were testing whether the line was really connected. Audrey. Preston sat down heavily on the porch steps, the phone pressed to his ear. Hi, I'm so glad you called. There was a long pause, filled with the weight of 3 years of unspoken words. Preston waited, afraid that saying anything more would cause her to hang up. Mom told me about the factory closing, Audrey said finally. She said you moved away, that you're living on some farm in Virginia. Preston's mind raced. How had Brenda known? He hadn't told her. Then he remembered. He'd updated his address with the post office, and some mail must have been forwarded here. Brenda must have called the forwarding address, or somehow tracked him down. Yes, Preston said. I'm on a farm, outside a town called Crestwood. It's a long story. Are you okay? The question caught him off guard. There was genuine concern in her voice, not just polite inquiry. I am, Preston said, and realized with surprise that it was true. I'm actually doing okay. Better than I was. Another pause. Preston could hear background noise, traffic, voices. She was outside somewhere, maybe on her lunch break. I've been thinking about our last conversation, Audrey said, her voice tightening. About what you said when Travis and I broke up. Preston's stomach dropped. Here it was, the reckoning he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Audrey, I'm so sorry. Let me finish, she interrupted, not unkindly. You were right about him. About everything. He was controlling and manipulative, and I should have seen it sooner. But the way you said I told you so, her voice cracked slightly. I needed my father, and instead I got someone who cared more about being right than about how much I was hurting. Preston closed his eyes, the words landing like physical blows. You're right. You're absolutely right. I was cruel when you needed comfort. I prioritized my judgment over your pain. And I'm sorry, Audrey. I'm so deeply sorry. He heard her breathing on the other end of the line, processing his words. You sound different, she said after a moment. I feel different, Preston admitted. The last few months, losing my job, ending up here, it's given me a lot of time to think about the things I got wrong. The ways I failed you and your mother. The ways I let pride and stubbornness damage the relationships that mattered most. Mom said you were living with some old man who gave you his farm. That sounds insane. Despite the tension, Preston almost laughed. It does sound insane when you say it like that. His name is Wendell. He offered me a place to stay when my truck broke down, and then he offered me work, and then, Preston paused, still somewhat amazed by it himself. Then he offered me the farm. He's elderly, his children don't want it, and he didn't want it to go to developers. So he gave it to me. Just gave it to you? Audrey's skepticism was clear. Just gave it to me. We're making it legal with paperwork, but yes, it's mine now. Audrey was quiet, absorbing this. Preston could almost hear her trying to reconcile this story with the father she'd known, the factory worker who'd never taken risks, who'd played everything safe. What do you do there? She asked. Everything, Preston said. Fix things that are broken, plant things that need to grow, take care of the animals. Learn from Wendell. It's simple work, but it matters. I feel useful in a way I haven't in years. Another long pause. Then, would you want me to visit? Preston's breath caught. More than anything. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you, Audrey said carefully. I'm not promising anything, but I want to see this place. See if you've really changed, or if this is just another phase. That's fair, Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. That's more than fair. When were you thinking? I have some time off next month. 2 weeks in April. Would that work? Yes, absolutely, yes. Preston was already mentally cataloguing everything that needed to be done before she arrived. They discussed logistics. She'd fly into Richmond, he'd pick her up at the airport. The conversation remained somewhat stilted, years of hurt creating careful distance. But it was a conversation. After 3 years of silence, it was everything. Dad, Audrey said just before hanging up. Yes? Don't make this perfect. Don't try too hard. Just be honest. That's all I'm asking for. I will be, Preston promised. I'll be honest. After she hung up, Preston sat on the porch steps for a long time, the phone still in his hand, his heart pounding. Tucker came over and nudged his hand, sensing the shift in his human's emotional state. Preston scratched behind the dog's ears absently, staring out at the farm without really seeing it. Wendell emerged from the barn, saw Preston's face, and walked over slowly. Everything all right? He asked. My daughter called, Preston said, his voice unsteady. She's coming to visit. Next month. Wendell sat down beside him on the steps, nodded slowly. That's good. That's real good. I don't know what to do, Preston admitted. How to prepare. What if she comes and decides I haven't changed enough? What if I say the wrong thing again? Wendell was quiet for a moment, considering. You remember what I told you that first night? About children needing to see us change, not just hear us say we're sorry. Preston nodded. Well, she's giving you the chance to show her. That's a gift. Don't waste it trying to be perfect. Just be present, be honest. Be the father she needs, not the one you think you should be. Preston absorbed this wisdom, feeling its weight and truth. 1 month, he said. I have 1 month. Then let's make good use of it, Wendell said, standing and offering Preston his hand. But first, let's finish this porch. Work helps settle the mind. Preston took his hand, stood, and picked up his hammer. Wendell was right. Work did help. But as he drove nails into new boards, his mind was already racing ahead, planning, hoping, and praying that 1 month would be enough time to become the father his daughter deserved. Preston threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even Wendell. The phone call had lit something inside him, not just hope, but purpose sharper than any he'd felt in years. Every repair, every improvement to the farm became part of his preparation. He wanted everything right when Audrey arrived. The morning after her call, Wendell appeared at breakfast carrying a battered red metal toolbox. He set it on the kitchen table with a solid thunk, decades of use evident in every dent and scratch. "Used these for 50 years, Wendell said, opening the lid to reveal an array of hand tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, each worn smooth by countless hours of work. Time they worked for someone else. Preston ran his fingers over a wooden-handled hammer, felt the groove where Wendell's thumb had rested 10,000 times. "I can't take these. They're tools," Wendell interrupted gently. "Made to be used, not admired. Besides, I've got another set in the barn. These belong to my father. He'd be glad to know they're still working." Preston understood the gift for what it was, not just tools, but trust, an inheritance of more than objects. He accepted with a nod, knowing words would diminish the moment. The days that followed fell into a pattern of purposeful labor. Preston began with the farmhouse itself, addressing years of deferred maintenance. He patched the roof where shingles had blown loose, replaced cracked window panes, tightened door hinges that had sagged over time. Each evening he'd collapse into bed, with aching muscles and satisfaction deeper than exhaustion. But the work was only part of what Preston needed to learn. Farming itself, the patient art of coaxing life from soil, was entirely new to him. Wendell became his teacher, leading him through lessons that went far beyond simple instruction. In the apple orchard one morning, Wendell demonstrated grafting techniques, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision. "You're joining two living things," he explained, showing Preston how to make the cuts, how to bind the graft. "The rootstock gives strength and stability. The scion gives fruit. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone." Preston tried to replicate the cuts, made them too shallow the first time, too deep the second. Wendell corrected patiently, without criticism. "Grafting's like most things worth doing," Wendell observed. "Takes practice, takes patience, and you'll kill a few before you get it right. But once you understand it, you can create something better than what you started with." Preston heard the metaphor clearly. He was the rootstock, stable now, grounded in this place. But he needed to graft something new onto that foundation, something that could bear fruit. Throughout these lessons, Tucker was a constant presence, following them from orchard to garden to barn. The old dog had found new energy in the farm's open spaces, and Preston noticed with gratitude how the work had changed him too. His own body was transforming, pounds dropping away, muscles strengthening, the chronic ache in his lower back fading as he moved more and sat less. Preston began texting Audrey photos of the farm. Not constantly, not pushing, just occasional updates. The chicken coop at dawn, light slanting through the gaps. Tucker running through tall grass, ears flying. The view from the porch at sunset, the orchard silhouetted against orange sky. Her responses were sparse at first, sometimes just an emoji acknowledgement. Once nothing for 3 days, and Preston had to fight the urge to send more, to explain, to fill the silence with his own anxiety. Then finally, "Looks peaceful." Those 2 words felt like victory. Preston read them over and over, searching for tone, for subtext, for any hint of her feelings. He settled on cautious optimism and continued his measured updates. One afternoon, while clearing the overgrown vegetable garden, Preston found himself thinking about teaching Audrey to ride a bicycle. She'd been 6, fearless, demanding he let go of the seat even though she wasn't ready. He'd run alongside her, hand hovering near but not touching, until she'd found her balance and pedaled away, shrieking with joy and triumph. When had he stopped trusting her to find her balance? When had he started believing his job was to hold on, to control, to prevent falls, rather than help her learn to catch herself? The physical work became a kind of meditation, his hands busy while his mind processed years of mistakes. Each weed pulled from the garden felt like removing something toxic from himself. Each fence post straightened felt like correcting some inner misalignment. Wendell noticed Preston's distraction during a fence repair, watched him miss a measurement twice. "You're thinking too far ahead," Wendell said. "Focus on the post in front of you." Preston set down his tools, admitted what was churning in his mind. "What if I've changed too late? What if she comes and sees I'm still the man who hurt her?" Wendell leaned against the fence post they'd just set, considered his answer carefully. "Then you prove her wrong. Not with words, with time. You can't convince someone you've changed. You have to show them day after day, in ways too small to be lies." "I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing again," Preston confessed. "That I'll hurt her without meaning to." "You probably will," Wendell said, not unkindly. "Nobody gets it perfect, especially with people they love. The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes. It's what you'll do when you make them." The first complication arrived on a Saturday morning. Preston was assessing damage to the barn roof, missing shingles, rotted underlayment in one corner, when he realized the repair was beyond his current skills. The job required more hands, more expertise, more everything than he possessed alone. He mentioned it to Wendell over lunch. "Need to ask for help in town?" Wendell said simply. "Introduce you to folks. Can't run a farm in isolation, you need neighbors." Preston's instinct was to refuse. He'd been isolated for months now, preferred it that way. The thought of meeting new people, explaining himself, making small talk, it all felt exhausting. But Wendell was gently insistent. "You can't rebuild a life by yourself. Farm needs neighbors, and so do you. Besides, these are good people. They help their own." Saturday morning, Wendell drove them into Crestwood. The town was small, the kind of place where 3 stoplights seemed like too many. Main Street held a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a church with a white steeple that probably predated the Civil War. Everything looked maintained but not modernized, comfortable with its own history. The hardware store smelled of sawdust and motor oil. Dwayne, the owner, was mid-60s with a generous belly and an easy smile. Wendell introduced Preston, explained about the barn roof. "Shouldn't be too hard to round up some help," Dwayne said, already thinking through logistics. "Virgil's always looking for an excuse to avoid his honey-do list. I'll make some calls. We'll get you fixed up." "I can pay," Preston started, but Dwayne waved him off. "We don't work like that here. You help us, we help you. That's how small towns survive." They had coffee at the diner, strong and bitter in thick ceramic mugs. Local farmers greeted Wendell warmly, sized up Preston with friendly curiosity. One of them, Virgil, was early 70s with forearms like iron and a handshake that could crack walnuts. "So you're taking over Wendell's place," Virgil said. It wasn't quite a question. "Trying to," Preston said. "Learning as I go." "We all did," Virgil said. "Nobody's born knowing how to farm." "What are your plans for the land?" Preston described his vision, modest but genuine. Restore the orchard to full production, expand the garden, maybe add some livestock eventually. Nothing ambitious, just sustainable. Virgil nodded approval. "Sounds right." Wendell chose well. "We'll help however we can." The unexpected acceptance unsettled Preston. He wasn't used to community, to being welcomed without proving himself first. In the factory, respect had to be earned through seniority and output. Here, Wendell's endorsement seemed to be enough. Driving back, Preston was quiet, processing the morning. "You look troubled," Wendell observed. "I'm not used to people being kind for no reason," Preston admitted. "There's a reason," Wendell said. "You're part of the community now. That's how it works here. We take care of our own. And you're one of us." That evening, Preston received a longer text from Audrey. She asked about his days, what he did, whether he was really happy or just pretending. Preston responded honestly. The work was hard, the learning curve steep, but he felt useful for the first time in years. He felt like he mattered. Audrey's response came quickly. "I'm glad. You sound different." Preston stared at those words, heard in them the faint possibility of hope. He asked again if she'd consider visiting, added that there was no pressure, just an open invitation whenever she was ready. Her reply made his hands shake. "I'm thinking about it. Don't rush me." Preston agreed immediately, promised to wait on her timeline. But inside, his heart hammered with cautious hope. He sat on the porch with Wendell, shared the exchange. Wendell smiled quietly. "She's coming," the old man said with certainty. Maybe not tomorrow, but she's coming. Her daughter doesn't keep texting if she's decided to stay away. Preston wanted desperately to believe it. He looked at the red toolbox sitting on the porch rail, its paint faded, but its tools still sharp and useful. Like those tools, maybe he could be transformed by use, worn smooth by the right kind of work until he became what his daughter needed him to be. Tomorrow he'd start on the barn with help from neighbors he hadn't known a week ago. Tomorrow he'd plant more seeds in the garden, grafting new growth onto old roots. Tomorrow he'd continue the patient work of becoming someone worthy of a second chance. But tonight he sat with Wendell in comfortable silence, Tucker at his feet, and let himself feel something he'd almost forgotten, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're moving in the right direction, even if the destination is still uncertain. Sunday morning arrived with the sound of trucks crunching up the gravel drive. Preston was on the porch with his first coffee, when 4 men emerged carrying tools, lumber, and paper bags that smelled of breakfast sandwiches. Virgil led the group, followed by Dwayne and 2 younger farmers Preston hadn't met, Gordon, maybe 40 with graying temples, and Tate, late 30s, with the lean build of someone who'd worked physically his whole life. They greeted Preston with handshakes and easy smiles, the kind of men comfortable in their own skin and generous with their time. "Figured we'd tackle that barn roof before it gets too hot," Virgil said, setting down a toolbox that looked nearly as old as Wendell's. "Brought extra shingles and some coffee to keep us honest." Preston was overwhelmed by the gesture, struggled to find adequate words. "I really appreciate this. I don't know how to thank you." "Thank us by paying it forward someday," Dwayne said simply. "That's how it works." The work began with the easy rhythm of men who'd done this before, not together necessarily, but often enough that the pattern was familiar. They stripped damaged shingles, inspected and reinforced beams where needed, measured and cut and nailed with practiced efficiency. Preston worked alongside them, learning techniques, listening to their stories, feeling himself slowly integrated into something larger than himself. During lunch break, they gathered in the barn's shade, sharing sandwiches their wives had packed. The conversation was casual but revealing. Virgil talked about his grandchildren, who visited every summer, teaching them the same skills his father had taught him. Gordon mentioned his daughter had just graduated college, started teaching at the elementary school in town. The easy talk of family made Preston's chest ache with what he'd lost. He must have shown something in his face, because Dwayne asked gently if Preston had family who'd be visiting. Preston hesitated, then decided on honesty. "My daughter. We've been estranged for 3 years, but we're talking again. She might visit next month." Tate, who'd been quiet until then, looked up with sudden recognition in his eyes. "Didn't speak to my father for 5 years," he said. "Stupid pride on both sides, old arguments that stopped mattering, but neither of us would let go. Took his heart attack to break me out of it." He paused, looked directly at Preston. "Don't wait that long. Don't let pride or fear keep you from fixing what's broken. I got lucky. My dad survived, and we had 8 more good years before he passed. But we could have had 13 if I hadn't been such a stubborn fool." The words landed with weight. Preston nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. "She's giving you a chance," Tate continued. "That's more than some people get. Make it count." By late afternoon, the barn roof was complete, weather-tight and sturdy, evidence of what community could accomplish. The men refused payment beyond Preston's gratitude, and a promise to help when one of them needed it. As they packed their tools, Virgil extended one more invitation. "Church tomorrow morning if you're interested. Not pressure, just so you know you're welcome." Preston thanked him, said he'd think about it. After they left, he stood looking at the barn, at the work they'd done not for payment but for connection, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone anymore. Somehow, without fully realizing it, he'd become part of something. That night, exhausted and grateful, Preston explored the farmhouse more thoroughly than he had before. He'd been living here for weeks, but had mostly stuck to the kitchen, living room, and his bedroom. Now, thinking about Audrey's visit, he examined the space with fresh eyes. The main bedroom, the one that had been Wendell's before he moved to the cottage, had potential as a guest room. It was larger than Preston's current space, with windows facing east that would catch morning light. Preston opened the closet, found it mostly empty except for a cedar chest pushed to the back. He pulled the chest out, sat on the floor and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a quilt. He unfolded it slowly, spreading it across the floor to see its full design. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Hundreds of fabric squares had been sewn together, each depicting a scene from farm life. A red barn, apple trees heavy with fruit, children playing in a field. A man and woman standing together at sunset, their silhouettes holding hands. Every stitch was tiny and precise, the work of hands that had known both love and patience. Preston carried the quilt to Wendell's cottage, found the old man reading on his porch. "Found this in the bedroom," Preston said, holding up the quilt. Wendell's eyes went soft with memory. He reached out, touched the fabric with gentle fingers. "Margaret made that the year before she passed. She was too weak to finish. Our daughter helped with the final squares." He traced the image of the couple at sunset. She believed broken things could be made whole again. That's what she was showing with these patches, how separate pieces, even torn or damaged ones, could be stitched into something beautiful. Preston looked at the quilt with new understanding. "I'd like to use it in the guest room for when Audrey comes. If that's okay." Wendell nodded slowly. Margaret would have liked that. She always said a home should embrace people, not just shelter them. Preston returned to the farmhouse, chose the east-facing bedroom for Audrey. He spent the evening cleaning thoroughly, washing windows until they sparkled, scrubbing floors, repairing a loose door hinge. He made the bed with fresh sheets and placed the quilt on top, stepping back to assess the effect. The room felt warm now, inviting. A place where someone could rest and feel safe. But was it enough? Would Audrey see the care he'd taken, or would she see a man trying too hard to compensate for years of failure? Preston took a photo of the room and sent it to Audrey with a simple caption, "Just in case you decide to visit." No pressure. An hour later his phone chimed. A heart emoji. Just that, no words, just a small red heart. Preston stared at it, afraid to read too much meaning into a single symbol, but unable to stop hope from blooming in his chest. He lay in his own bed that night, Tucker curled at his feet, thinking about the quilt and what Wendell had said about Margaret's belief in restoration. Broken things made whole again. Separate pieces stitched into something beautiful. Was that what he was doing here? Taking the scattered, damaged pieces of his life and trying to sew them into something that could hold together. Morning brought new energy. Preston made a list of small touches for the guest room. Fresh flowers when they bloomed, a reading lamp, clean curtains. He was building not just a room, but an offering, a tangible apology that said, "I remember who you were. I'm sorry for who I became. I'm trying to be better." Wendell found him measuring the window for curtains and smiled with gentle amusement. "You're nesting," he observed. Preston laughed, admitted it was true. "I want her to see I've changed. That I can make a home, not just occupy a house." "You're learning what took me years to figure out," Wendell said. "A place becomes a home when you're willing to share it, when you stop holding it for yourself and open it to others." They worked together that afternoon, Wendell advising while Preston installed a curtain rod, replaced a worn lampshade, added small touches that transformed the room from adequate to welcoming. When they finished, Preston stood in the doorway, satisfied with what he'd created. "Everything's ready," he said. "The room is ready," Wendell corrected gently. "Now you need to get ready." And that's harder work, Preston understood. The room was external preparation, something he could control. But being ready for Audrey, being the father she needed, required internal work that couldn't be measured or photographed. It required him to be present, honest, humble, to listen more than he spoke, to value her autonomy over his need to be right. That evening, Preston sent one more text. "The room is ready whenever you are. I'm ready too." No response came that night. Preston tried not to obsess, tried to trust the process. He sat on the porch with Tucker, watching fireflies emerge in the field, their small lights pulsing in the darkness. Each one was separate, independent, yet together they created something beautiful, a constellation of hope against the night. He thought about the quilt upstairs, about Margaret's belief in restoration, about Tate's warning not to wait too long, about Wendell's gentle wisdom that change had to be shown, not declared. Preston had 3 more weeks until Audrey's planned visit. 3 weeks to continue becoming someone worthy of the second chance she was offering. He couldn't make himself perfect. Perfection wasn't what she needed, but he could make himself present, honest, and willing to keep trying even when it was hard. Tucker nudged his hand, and Preston scratched behind the dog's ears, taking comfort in the simple exchange. The farm settled into evening quiet around them. Chickens roosting, wind through the apple trees, the distant hoot of an owl claiming its territory. Preston closed his eyes and whispered to the darkness, to himself, to whatever force had brought him to this place. Let me get this right. Please let me get this right. The fireflies continued their silent dance, and somewhere inside the house, a quilt waited on a bed, hundreds of broken pieces stitched into wholeness, ready to embrace whoever needed its warmth. 2 weeks passed, with no word from Audrey after the heart emoji. Preston tried not to obsess, channeling his anxiety into the endless work the farm required. Spring was advancing rapidly now. The garden beds needed planting. The orchard required pruning. Fences demanded constant attention. He welcomed the exhaustion that came with physical labor, the way it quieted his racing thoughts. One morning, Wendell appeared at breakfast, carrying a worn catalogue, its pages dog-eared and marked with decades of penciled notes. He set it on the kitchen table between their coffee cups. "Seed catalogue," Wendell explained. "Time to decide what we're planting." They spent the morning at that table, Wendell's gnarled finger tracing entries while he shared accumulated wisdom. Which tomato varieties resisted the blight that came with Virginia's humid summers? Which corn thrived in their particular soil composition? How to stagger plantings so the harvest stretched across months rather than overwhelming them in a single week. Preston studied Wendell's notes, decades of observations compressed into margins and scribbled beside variety names. The catalogue wasn't just a shopping list, but a record of trial and error, of learning what worked through patient failure and incremental success. "You put seeds in the ground not knowing if they'll grow," Preston mused, running his finger down a page of heirloom beans. "That's faith," Wendell said simply. "You do the work, trust the process, hope for the best. Don't control the weather or the insects or a dozen other things. Just plant good seeds in good soil and give them what they need." Preston heard the metaphor clearly. He was planting something with Audrey, too, putting careful effort into soil he couldn't control, hoping that with enough care and patience, something good might grow between them. They ordered seeds, heirloom tomatoes that Wendell swore by, green beans for fresh eating and canning, summer squash, cucumbers. Preston added wildflower seeds, thinking of the view from Audrey's window, something colorful and alive to greet her in the mornings. The packages arrived within a week, and Preston began the methodical work of preparation, tilling soil until it was loose and rich, building raised beds from reclaimed lumber, stringing trellises for climbing plants. Each task required attention and patience, and Preston found himself settling into the rhythm of it, his anxiety gradually transforming into focused purpose. Tucker aged backward, it seemed. The old dog spent his days racing through fields, investigating every corner of the property, collapsing in exhausted contentment each evening. Preston noticed his own body continuing to change too, his hands developing new calluses, his shoulders broadening slightly, the chronic tightness in his back completely gone. Purpose agreed with him in ways a gym membership never had. Mid-morning on a Tuesday, an unfamiliar sedan pulled into the drive. Preston's heart leaped. Could it be Audrey arriving early unannounced? But the woman who emerged was older, well-dressed in a way that seemed incongruous with farm visits, carrying a leather briefcase. She introduced herself as Felicity Abrams, real estate agent. Her smile was professional, practiced, revealing nothing genuine. "I've been trying to reach Wendell about selling the farm," she said, her tone suggesting this was a reasonable conversation rather than an intrusion. "I represent a development group interested in the property." Preston felt his defenses rise immediately. The farm isn't for sale. Wendell gave it to me. Felicity's eyebrows lifted slightly, skepticism clear in her expression. Gave it to you? Is there paperwork documenting this transfer? Preston realized with uncomfortable clarity that there wasn't. Not yet. They'd done everything on a handshake and trust, planning to formalize it, but not treating it as urgent. We're working on the legal documentation, Preston said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I see. Felicity pulled a business card from her briefcase, extended it with manicured fingers. Well, when you realize you're in over your head, and you will be, these small farms don't survive anymore, give me a call. My clients are offering serious money, far more than this land is worth as a working farm. Preston took the card reflexively, his jaw tight. We're not interested. Of course not. Not yet. Felicity's smile didn't waver. But reality has a way of changing perspectives. Good luck with your farming experiment. She drove away, leaving Preston standing in the drive with her business card burning in his hand. The encounter had planted seeds of doubt he didn't want. Was he fooling himself? Could he really make this work? Or was he just playing at being a farmer, destined to fail and prove people like Felicity right? He found Wendell in the orchard, told him about the visit. Wendell's face darkened. She's been circling for years, he said. Developers want to build subdivision housing. 47 acres this close to town. They could squeeze 100 houses onto this land and make millions. Preston asked about formalizing the transfer. Shouldn't they handle the legal side soon? Wendell nodded slowly. Been putting it off. I'll call the lawyer this week. Want to make sure nobody can challenge your claim when I'm gone. The conversation turned mortal in a way Preston hadn't fully confronted before. Wendell was 78. He wouldn't be around forever. Preston had been so focused on learning from him that he hadn't considered what losing him would mean. You worried? Preston asked carefully. Not about you, Wendell said. How about what happens after? Want everything clean and legal so my children can't cause problems. Not that they would intentionally, but people get complicated when inheritances are involved. They agreed to handle the paperwork properly. Preston felt both relieved and unsettled. Making it legal made it real, made this new life undeniable rather than temporary. That afternoon his phone rang. Audrey's name on the screen made his pulse spike. Hi, he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. Hi, Dad. Her voice was softer than before, less guarded. I've been thinking about your invitation. I have time off in April. Would 2 weeks work for you? Preston's heart soared. Yes, absolutely yes. That would be perfect. They discussed logistics. She'd fly into Richmond on the 15th, stay through the end of the month. Preston offered to pick her up at the airport. Audrey agreed, then added carefully, I'm not promising anything. This is just me wanting to see what you've been doing. See if you've really changed. That's all I'm asking for, Preston said. A chance to show you. After they hung up, Preston sat stunned. She was coming. In less than a month, Audrey would be here. He walked to Wendell's cottage in a daze, shared the news. Wendell's face broke into a genuine smile. Well then, we've got work to do. 1 month to make this place shine. They made plans, finishing touches on the guest room, painting the porch, repairing the front gate that stuck. Preston wanted everything perfect, Wendell cautioned him. Don't make it so perfect she feels she can't touch anything. Make it lived-in, welcoming. She needs to see a home, not a museum. Preston understood the wisdom, but struggled against his perfectionist impulses. Everything needed to be right, because he'd gotten so much wrong before. That evening, he sat with the seed catalogue again, found the page on sunflowers. Something stirred in his memory. Audrey as a small child, maybe 5 years old, standing in a field of sunflowers that towered over her. She'd laughed with pure delight, spinning in circles, trying to see all their faces at once. He'd forgotten that memory until now, forgotten how she'd loved sunflowers, how she'd drawn them constantly that summer. Preston marked the page, ordered extra sunflower seeds. He'd plant them where she could see them from her window, a living reminder that he remembered who she'd been, who they'd been together, before everything broke. The seeds arrived 2 days later, and Preston spent an afternoon preparing a special bed beneath Audrey's window. The soil was perfect, rich and dark, ready to nurture whatever was planted. He pushed the large seeds into the earth carefully, covered them gently, watered them with more attention than perhaps they required. "You're talking to them," Wendell observed with amusement, watching from the porch. Preston laughed, embarrassed. "Just willing them to grow fast enough for her to see them. They'll grow on their own schedule," Wendell said. "But I appreciate the sentiment." That night, Preston stood at Audrey's window, looking down at the freshly planted bed. In a month, there should be at least shoots, maybe small stalks. By the time she left, if she stayed the full 2 weeks, there might even be buds forming. He pulled out his phone, almost texted her about the sunflowers, then stopped himself. Better to let it be a surprise. Better to let her discover it herself, see that he remembered without him announcing it. Preston looked at Felicity's business card, still sitting on his dresser. He picked it up, carried it downstairs, and dropped it in the kitchen trash. This farm wasn't going anywhere. It was his now, legally soon, but more importantly, in every way that mattered. He stood on the porch in the darkness, Tucker beside him, and looked at the property that had saved him. 1 month until Audrey arrived. 30 days to continue becoming the father she deserved. The seeds were planted, literal and metaphorical. Now came the hardest part, trusting the process, doing the work, and having faith that something good would grow from patient effort and honest care. 3 weeks until Audrey's arrival. Time moved with strange elasticity, days flying past in a blur of work, yet each evening stretching endlessly as Preston lay awake mentally rehearsing conversations that might never happen. He worked from dawn until his body demanded rest, painting the porch rails a fresh white, repairing the front gate until it swung smoothly, planting the garden with methodical care. The sunflower seeds had sprouted, small green shoots pushing through the dark soil. Preston checked them obsessively, willing them to grow faster. Wendell's persistent cough worried Preston more than the old man would admit. What had started as a minor irritation had deepened into something that shook Wendell's frame when it took hold. Preston urged him to see a doctor. Wendell waved off the concern as spring allergies, nothing serious. The lawyer came on a Thursday, an efficient woman named Patricia Chen, who spread documents across Wendell's kitchen table with business-like precision. Preston signed where indicated, his hand steady despite the magnitude of what the papers represented. The farm was officially his, 47 acres, all structures, all equipment. Wendell's signature joined his own, and Patricia notarized everything with professional detachment. "Your children are aware of this transfer?" Patricia asked Wendell, a final verification. "Told them months ago," Wendell confirmed. They were relieved. None of them wanted the responsibility. After Patricia left, Preston asked the question that had been nagging him. "Do they resent me, taking what might have been their inheritance?" Wendell was quiet for a long moment. "They resent the farm more than they could ever resent you. I made mistakes when they were young, prioritized this place over them more times than I should have. They associate this land with my absence, not their childhood joy." The admission hung heavy between them. Preston understood he was hearing something Wendell rarely voiced, the regret that came from choosing wrong too many times. "I don't want to make your mistakes," Preston said carefully. "Then don't," Wendell replied simply. "When Audrey comes, be present with her. The farm will still be here. The work will wait. She won't wait forever." The words lodged in Preston's chest like a warning. 2 days later, Wendell's cough worsened dramatically. Preston found him in bed at mid-morning, which was unprecedented. Wendell was always up before dawn. His breathing was labored, his skin pale beneath its weathered tan. Preston called the doctor, who came within the hour, and diagnosed pneumonia. Antibiotics, rest, monitoring. Wendell needed to stay in bed, avoid exertion, let his body heal. "I wanted to be here when your daughter arrives," Wendell said, his voice weak with frustration and fever. "You will be," Preston assured him, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "You're tougher than pneumonia." But privately, Preston worried. Wendell looked diminished, older than his 78 years, his strength visibly depleted. Preston moved into caretaker mode, bringing meals, ensuring Wendell took his medication, checking on him multiple times daily. The farm work fell entirely on Preston's shoulders now. He managed, but barely. The chickens still needed feeding. The garden required constant attention. Fences demanded repairs that couldn't be postponed. Preston rose earlier, worked later, fell into bed each night exhausted beyond thought. Virgil and Dwayne appeared unbidden on Saturday morning, saw Preston's haggard state, and simply started working. They fed chickens, watered the garden, handled the tasks Preston couldn't reach. The community support kept everything functioning, but Preston felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder each day. 1 week until Audrey's arrival. Preston looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself, unshaven, hollow-eyed, running on coffee and determination. The farm was beautiful, painted, planted, pristine, but he was ragged, worn thin by effort and worry. Wendell, improving slightly, noticed Preston's condition when he brought dinner to the cottage. "You're running yourself into the ground," Wendell observed, his voice still rough but stronger than before. "She won't care if the porch rail is perfect." Preston sat heavily in the chair beside Wendell's bed. "I need everything to be right. I can't fail at this." "You're thinking about it wrong," Wendell said gently. "This isn't a test you pass or fail. It's a reunion. Two people trying to find their way back to each other." Preston felt something crack inside him. "What if I say the wrong thing again? What if I hurt her without meaning to?" "Then you apologize," Wendell said simply. "And you try again. That's what love does. It keeps trying." The simplicity of it struck Preston like a revelation. He'd been approaching Audrey's visit as a performance he had to nail perfectly, rather than a conversation that would unfold organically, with mistakes and recoveries and honest effort. That night, Preston allowed himself to rest. He sat in Audrey's room, holding the small wooden music box he'd placed on her dresser days ago. He wound the key, listened to "You Are My Sunshine" play its slightly off-key melody. He'd sung that song to her when she was small, before everything got complicated. Before his opinions became rigid, before his fear for her safety transformed into controlling behavior, before he'd valued being right over being kind. The music stopped. Preston set the box down gently, looked around the room. The quilt spread across the bed, each patch telling a story of family and continuity. The view of young sunflowers reaching toward light. The lamp casting warm glow across clean surfaces. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It said, "I remember who you were. I'm sorry for who I became. I'm different now." Preston's phone buzzed. A text from Audrey, landing at 10:15 a.m. next Saturday. "Still okay to pick me up?" His hands trembled as he typed, "I'll be there. Can't wait to see you." Her response came quickly. "Me too. Nervous, but me too." Preston read those words over and over. She was nervous too. This wasn't just his fear, his test. It was mutual uncertainty, both of them stepping into unknown territory together. He slept deeply that night for the first time in weeks. Morning brought renewed energy. Wendell was well enough to sit on his porch, color returning to his face, cough finally loosening its grip. The crisis had passed. Preston spent the final week not in frantic preparation, but in quiet maintenance. He tended the garden, checked the sunflowers, now 6 inches tall with true leaves emerging, and simply let himself be present in the space he'd created. One evening, he caught fireflies in an old jar he'd found in the barn, something he'd done with Audrey when she was young. He sat on the porch steps watching their soft pulsing light, remembering how she'd insisted on releasing them before bed, because they need to be free. He released them now, watching them disappear into the gathering darkness. Tucker lay beside him, head on his paws, patient and steady as always. "She's coming tomorrow," Preston told the dog. Tucker's tail thumped acknowledgement. Preston thought about the wallet in his truck, still carrying Audrey's childhood photo. Thought about the music box upstairs, waiting to play its nostalgic tune. Thought about the sunflowers growing toward light, about the quilt stitched from broken pieces, about the farm that had given him space to become someone new. He wasn't the same man who'd said, "I told you so" 3 years ago. That man had been rigid with the need to be right, unable to allow his daughter her own mistakes and growth. This man, the one he'd become through soil and sweat and Wendell's patient wisdom, understood that love meant presence, not control. That being a father meant listening more than speaking, supporting more than directing. Tomorrow would come. Audrey would arrive with her own fears and hopes and carefully maintained boundaries. Preston couldn't control how it would unfold. He could only show up honestly, listen carefully, and prove through small actions that he'd earned the second chance she was offering. He stood, called Tucker inside, turned off the lights. The farm settled into night around him. Familiar now, home in ways his old apartment had never been. Whatever happened tomorrow, he was ready. Not perfect, but present. Not without fear, but willing to face it. Preston set his alarm for 5 a.m., giving himself plenty of time to shower, dress carefully, make the drive to Richmond. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and whispered one final prayer to whatever force had brought him here. Let me be the father she needs. Let me listen more than I talk. Let me be present, honest, humble. Let this be the beginning of something good. Sleep came eventually, and with it, dreams of sunflowers and sunshine, of laughter reconstructed from memory, of bridges rebuilt one careful plank at a time. Tomorrow, everything would change, or begin again. The farm waited in darkness, the guest room prepared with love, the sunflowers reaching steadily upward, and Preston's heart full of cautious, hard-won hope. 3 days until Audrey's arrival. Preston was bringing lunch to Wendell's cottage when he noticed a letter on the floor, apparently fallen from Wendell's lap as he dozed in his chair. Preston bent to retrieve it, intending simply to set it aside, but his own name caught his eye in the second paragraph. He hesitated, knowing he shouldn't read another person's correspondence. But the words pulled at him, and curiosity, maybe something deeper than curiosity, won out. He sat on the porch steps and read. The letter was from Constance, Wendell's daughter, dated 2 years earlier. The handwriting was precise, controlled, but the words carried barely restrained anger and old pain. Dad, I can't keep making these visits. It's too hard. Every time I come back, I see that barn where you spent every evening instead of helping with homework. That orchard where you worked Sundays instead of coming to my piano recitals. The farm gave you purpose, I understand that. But it took you from us. Preston's chest tightened. He continued reading, unable to stop now. Mom bore the loneliness better than we did. She made excuses for you. Your father is providing for us. He's working for our future. But we didn't need more hay bales or a bigger barn. We needed you at the dinner table. We needed you present, not just physically there, but actually seeing us. The letter's tone shifted, became even more direct. I heard through Mom's sister that you're planning to give the farm to some stranger. Maybe he'll appreciate it more than we ever could. Maybe that's what you always wanted, someone who'd love this land the way you do. Someone who wouldn't need you to be a father, just a mentor for farm work. Preston felt like he'd been punched. He kept reading, compelled to understand. I don't hate you, Dad. I'm just tired of competing with 47 acres for your attention. I'm tired of this place being the most important thing in your life. So if giving it away to someone else brings you peace, then do it. Maybe he'll be the son you wished you'd had, one who cares more about soil and livestock than about feeling loved. The letter ended abruptly, signed simply Constance, with no closing endearment. Preston sat holding the paper, his hands shaking. He'd assumed Wendell's children simply weren't interested in farming, that they'd moved on to different lives and careers. The truth was far more painful. They'd been pushed away, made to feel secondary to the work, to the land, to everything that demanded Wendell's attention. Wendell stirred in his chair, opened his eyes, saw Preston with the letter. His face registered understanding, then resignation. You read it, Wendell said. It wasn't a question. It fell. I shouldn't have, but I did. I'm sorry. Wendell gestured for Preston to come inside, pointed to the chair across from him. Preston sat, the letter still in his hand, unsure what to say. Is this why you gave me the farm? Preston asked finally. Because your children didn't want it? Partly, Wendell admitted, his voice rough. But also because I saw in you what I was. A man who'd lost his family through his own mistakes. A man who didn't understand until too late that work can't love you back. Preston waited, sensing Wendell needed to explain fully. I was 30 when my father died and left me this place, Wendell began. Young, determined to prove I could make it work better than he did. I poured everything into the farm, 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I told myself I was building something for my family, securing their future. He paused, looking out the window at the land he'd given so much to. But I missed Nathan's first steps, because I was fixing a fence. Missed Constance's first piano recital, because calving season couldn't wait. Missed David's high school graduation, because the hay needed to be brought in before the rain came. Always something more urgent than the moments I can never get back. Preston felt the weight of these confessions, understood he was hearing something Wendell rarely voiced. Margaret tried to tell me. For years she'd say, they need you, not just your paycheck. They need their father, but I didn't listen. I thought providing meant working, that my presence at dinner was less important than ensuring we had food on the table. I was wrong. Did you ever tell them? Preston asked. That you understood? Too late, Wendell said quietly. By the time I realized what I'd sacrificed, they were grown and scattered. I apologized, but words can't rebuild years of absence. Constance is the angriest. She was the one who tried hardest to get my attention and got the least of it. Preston looked at the letter again, seeing it now as not just an angry daughter's words, but as a mirror held up to his own potential future. You gave me the farm hoping I'd do better, Preston said slowly. That I wouldn't make your mistakes. I gave you the farm because I hoped you'd learn what I learned too late, Wendell corrected. That land doesn't love you back. That crops and livestock can't replace human connection. That working yourself to exhaustion is easier than being emotionally present, but it costs more than you can imagine. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. Preston thought about the past weeks, his obsessive preparation, his need to make everything perfect, his exhaustion from trying to control every detail. I've been doing it again, Preston said, realization dawning. Making the farm perfect, instead of preparing myself to just be with Audrey. Wendell nodded. The farm looks beautiful, but she's not coming to see the farm. She's coming to see you, to find out if you've changed, if you can be present with her instead of distracted by the next task, the next problem, the next thing that seems urgent. Preston felt something fundamental shift in his understanding. He'd been approaching Audrey's visit as a showcase of his transformation. Look at what I've built, look at what I've accomplished, look at how I've changed. But Wendell was saying, none of that matters if you can't simply be with her, give her your full attention, listen without thinking about the fence that needs mending or the garden that needs weeding. What do I do? Preston asked. When she's here, let the work wait, Wendell said firmly. Don't check on the chickens during breakfast. Don't excuse yourself to fix something while she's talking. Don't make her compete with this place for your attention. The farm will still be here when she leaves. Your relationship with her won't survive if you make her feel secondary. Preston absorbed this, understanding the profound gift Wendell was giving him. Hard-won wisdom from decades of regret, offered early enough that Preston might avoid the same fate. I don't want to lose her again, Preston said, his voice breaking slightly. Then show her she's the priority, Wendell said. Not with words or grand gestures, but with attention, with presence, with the willingness to let everything else fade into background noise when she needs you. Preston stood, moved to the window, looked out at the farm he'd worked so hard to restore. It was beautiful, the neat garden rows, the painted porch, the sturdy barn roof. But Wendell was right. Audrey wouldn't care about any of that if he couldn't give her his undivided attention. Thank you, Preston said, turning back to Wendell, for telling me this now before I could repeat your mistakes. That's what I'm hoping to prevent, Wendell said. I can't undo my past, but maybe I can help you avoid the same regrets. This farm was my excuse for not doing the harder work of being present with the people I loved. Don't let it become yours. Preston walked back to the farmhouse, the letter's words echoing in his mind. He looked at the guest room he'd prepared so carefully, at the work list he'd been obsessively maintaining, at all the plans he'd made for Audrey's visit. He took out his phone, deleted the work list. Whatever needed doing on the farm could wait. For 2 weeks, or however long Audrey stayed, she would be his sole focus. Not the farm, not the improvements, not the next project, just her. That evening, Preston sat on the porch and did something he hadn't done in weeks, simply sat without working, without planning, without his mind racing ahead to the next task. Tucker lay beside him, and together they watched the sun set over the orchard, painting everything gold. The farm was beautiful, yes, but it was just a place, wood and soil and growing things. Audrey was his daughter, irreplaceable, worth more than any amount of land or livestock or perfect paint jobs. Preston made a promise to himself. When she arrived, he would be fully present. He would listen more than he spoke. He would let her set the pace, choose the activities, determine how much distance or closeness felt right. The farm had saved him by giving him space to change, but it couldn't complete that change. Only his relationship with Audrey could do that. 2 days until she arrived. Preston spent them not in frantic last-minute preparations, but in quiet rest, storing up energy for presence rather than performance. He was as ready as he could be, not because everything was perfect, but because he finally understood that perfection wasn't what either of them needed. What they needed was connection, and that would require all of him, not divided attention, not half presence, while his mind wandered to farm tasks, but full, complete focus on the daughter he'd lost and hoped desperately to find again. One day, until Audrey arrived. Preston woke before dawn, though he'd set no alarm. His body knew the importance of this day, refused to let him sleep through the anticipation that hummed beneath his skin. He made coffee, sat on the porch in the pre-dawn darkness with Tucker at his feet. The farm was quiet around them, that hushed moment between night and morning when even the birds haven't yet begun their songs. Preston used the silence to settle his mind, to remind himself of everything Wendell had taught him. Be present. Listen more than you speak. Let her set the pace. Wendell emerged from his cottage as the sun crested the horizon, moving slowly but with restored strength. The pneumonia had released its grip, leaving him weakened but recovering. He joined Preston on the porch, accepted the coffee Preston poured for him. "You nervous?" Wendell asked. "Terrified," Preston admitted. "But ready." "That's the right balance," Wendell said, approval in his voice. "Fear keeps you humble. Readiness lets you act anyway." They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence. Eggs from the chickens, bread from town, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Preston noticed his hands were steady, his breathing calm. The frantic energy that had driven him for weeks had transformed into something quieter, more grounded. After breakfast, Preston walked the property one final time. Not to check for flaws or make last-minute adjustments, but to ground himself in this place that had become home. He walked through the garden, where seeds were pushing through soil toward light. Past the barn with its solid new roof, testament to community and collaboration. Through the orchard, where buds were swelling on branches, promising fruit in months to come. The sunflowers beneath Audrey's window had grown to nearly a foot tall, their leaves broad and healthy, reaching eagerly upward. Preston knelt beside them, touched the soil, felt its warmth and moisture. Everything was ready. Everything was growing. By mid-morning, Preston had showered and dressed carefully. Clean jeans, a button-down shirt that Wendell had insisted he buy in town, boots polished but not new. He looked in the mirror and saw someone different from the man who'd broken down on Route 29 months ago. Not just physically, though that was obvious, leaner, stronger, weathered by sun and work. The difference was deeper in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders. He looked like someone who knew his place in the world, who'd found purpose beyond just surviving. Preston went to his truck, opened the glove compartment, and retrieved the small wooden music box that had been there for 3 years. He'd already placed it in Audrey's room, but he held it now, wound it, listened to You Are My Sunshine, play its slightly off-key tune one more time. This was what he was offering her, not perfection, but honest presence. Not a flawless father, but one who'd learned from his mistakes and was trying, genuinely trying to be better. He returned the music box to her room, placed it on the dresser where morning light would catch it. Then he stood in the doorway, looking at the space he'd prepared. The quilt on the bed, with its hundreds of carefully stitched pieces. The view of sunflowers reaching toward sky. the lamp casting warm light. Everything said, "You matter. You're welcomed. I remember who we were and hope for who we might become." Wendell found him standing there, lost in thought. "It's time," Wendell said gently. Preston nodded, called Tucker, and headed for the truck. Wendell walked him out, placed a hand on Preston's shoulder. "Remember what I told you," Wendell said. "When she's here, nothing else matters. Not the farm, not the work, not anything except being present with her." "I remember," Preston promised. "And Preston?" Wendell's grip tightened slightly. "Whatever happens, however it goes, you've already done something remarkable. You've changed yourself. That's not nothing." Preston felt his throat tighten with emotion. He embraced Wendell briefly, gratefully, then climbed into the truck. Tucker jumped into the passenger seat, his usual spot, tail wagging with the excitement of a trip. The drive to Richmond took an hour, but Preston barely registered the passing landscape. His mind kept returning to the last time he'd seen Audrey in person. 3 years ago, in a coffee shop in Oregon, where she'd agreed to meet him one final time before cutting contact completely. She'd been angry, hurt, immovable in her decision. He'd tried to explain, to apologize, but the words had come out wrong, defensive, when he'd meant them to be conciliatory. "I can't keep doing this," she'd said, standing to leave. "Every conversation with you leaves me feeling smaller, less capable, more judged. I need space from that. From you." He'd watched her walk away, too proud to chase after her, too hurt to try harder. That had been his last chance to fix things, and he'd failed. But now she was giving him another chance, flying across the country to see if he'd changed enough to earn a place in her life again. The weight of that trust, fragile as it was, settled over Preston like a mantle he had to prove worthy of carrying. The airport appeared ahead, massive and impersonal. Preston found parking, checked the flight status on his phone. On time, landed 10 minutes ago. His heart hammered against his ribs. He wiped his palms on his jeans, took several deep breaths, reminded himself again. Presence, listening, patience. "Stay," he told Tucker, cracking the windows. "I'll be back soon." Inside the terminal, Preston made his way to baggage claim, positioning himself where he could see arriving passengers. The space was crowded with reunions, families embracing, couples kissing, friends laughing. Preston stood alone, his eyes fixed on the escalator where travelers descended with their luggage and their stories. And then he saw her. Audrey emerged from the crowd, scanning the space with eyes that looked so much like his own. It hurt. She was taller than he remembered, or maybe he'd just forgotten. Her hair was shorter, cut to her shoulders. She wore jeans and a simple jacket, carried only a small backpack, traveling light, not committing to staying long. Preston's heart lurched at the sight of that small backpack. She wasn't planning to stay the full 2 weeks. Maybe not even one. She'd come prepared to leave quickly if this didn't work out. He raised his hand, caught her attention. Their eyes met across the space, and for a moment neither moved. Then Audrey walked toward him, her pace measured, her expression carefully neutral. They stood 3 feet apart. The distance felt enormous, a gulf filled with 3 years of silence and hurt. "Hi, Audrey," Preston said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm so glad you came." "Hi, Dad." The words sounded careful, not warm but not cold either. Testing the waters, trying out the title she hadn't used in years. Preston wanted to hug her, to close that 3-foot gap and hold his daughter the way he had when she was small. But he waited, letting her decide. Audrey stepped forward, offered a brief embrace. Her arms were stiff, the hug more courtesy than affection. Preston held her gently, not too tight, not too long, and when they separated he saw her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for coming," he said again. "I'm here," Audrey replied. "Let's see how it goes." The words were honest, unadorned. No false promises, no premature forgiveness. Just a daughter willing to try, and a father grateful for the chance. They walked to the truck in awkward silence. When Audrey saw Tucker through the window, her carefully maintained composure cracked. Her face transformed, genuine joy breaking through the guardedness. "Tucker!" She opened the door, and the old dog practically leaped into her arms, tail wagging so hard his entire body shook. Audrey dropped to her knees, buried her face in his fur, and Tucker covered her face with kisses. Preston watched, his heart swelling. Tucker was the bridge they needed, the connection that had never been broken, the love that had waited patiently for this moment. "I missed you," Audrey whispered to the dog, her voice thick. "I missed you so much." Preston loaded her backpack, so light, so temporary, and climbed into the driver's seat. Audrey settled Tucker between them, her hand resting on the dog's head. As Preston pulled out of the parking lot, heading back toward the farm, he glanced at his daughter. She was looking out the window, one hand absently scratching Tucker's ears, her expression distant and protected. This was his chance, his only chance. Whatever happened in the next days or weeks would determine whether they could find their way back to each other or whether this would be their final goodbye, packaged as one last attempt. Preston gripped the steering wheel and drove carefully toward home, toward the farm that had saved him, toward the future that remained uncertain but possible. Tucker sat between them, a living reminder of what they'd once been, and Preston allowed himself the smallest measure of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could be something like that again. The drive back to Crestwood stretched longer than an hour. Time moved differently with Audrey in the truck. Each minute waited with unspoken words, each silence filled with the history they carried between them. The first 15 minutes passed with careful small talk. Preston asked about her flight. Audrey said it was fine, uneventful. He commented on the weather, unseasonably warm for April. She agreed, looked out the window at the passing landscape. Preston fought the urge to fill the silence with chatter, to explain everything he'd prepared, to list all the ways he'd changed. Instead, he let the quiet settle, gave her space to speak when she was ready. After 20 minutes, Audrey asked about the farm. Preston described it simply. 47 acres, apple orchard, garden, old farmhouse. He kept his tone neutral, factual, not trying to sell her on anything. "And this old man just gave it to you?" Audrey's skepticism was clear. That seemed strange. Preston explained Wendell's situation, his wife gone, his children scattered and uninterested, his desire to see the land continue as a farm rather than be developed. He described the breakdown on Route 29, the meal that became a room that became an offer he couldn't refuse. "So you just stumbled into a free farm," Audrey said, her tone carrying an edge Preston recognized. "Resentment, maybe, or the unspoken accusation, more good fortune than you deserve." He didn't defend himself, didn't explain how broken he'd been when he arrived, how the farm had saved him. He simply said, "I was lucky. Wendell was kind." Audrey looked out the window, said nothing. Tucker, sensing the tension, whined softly and pressed closer to her. 30 minutes into the drive, the countryside deepened around them. Fields and forest replacing suburban sprawl, the sky opening up in a way it never did in cities. Audrey seemed to notice the shift, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Why did you want me to come?" she asked suddenly. Preston had rehearsed answers to this question 100 times. Now faced with her direct gaze, he abandoned all the careful words and spoke from his center. "Because I miss you. Because I'm sorry. Because I want to try again." "Try what again?" Audrey's voice hardened. "Being a father? You gave that up 3 years ago when you chose to be right instead of supportive." The words stung because they were true. Preston kept his eyes on the road, his voice steady. "I know I hurt you when you needed support. I was cruel when you needed comfort. I prioritize being right over being kind, and I can't undo that." Audrey glanced at him, surprised by the directness. "But I can show you I've learned from it," Preston continued. "If you'll let me. That's why I wanted you to come, not to prove anything, just to show you who I am now. And if that's still not enough, if you decide you can't forgive me, I'll understand. But I had to try." Audrey's jaw tightened. Preston could see her processing his words, testing them for sincerity against years of disappointment. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not asking for forgiveness yet," Preston said. "Just time. Just a chance to show up differently than I did before." They drove in silence for several miles. Preston's hands were steady on the wheel, but inside his heart pounded. Everything hinged on these moments. Whether Audrey could believe he'd truly changed, whether the trust he'd shattered could be even partially rebuilt. The sign appeared ahead, Ashby Farm, Callaway tended. Preston slowed, turned onto the gravel drive. Audrey read the sign aloud, her tone curious. Tended, not owned. Wendell's name stays, Preston explained. This was his life's work. I'm just the steward now, taking care of what he built. That's surprisingly humble for you, Audrey observed, and Preston heard both acknowledgement and skepticism in her voice. The farmhouse came into view, white clapboard weathered to grey, the wide porch with its fresh paint, the orchard beyond stretching toward distant tree lines. Preston watched Audrey take it in, trying to see it through her eyes. It's smaller than I imagined, she said. It's enough, Preston replied simply. He parked near the porch, turned off the engine. They sat for a moment in the truck's cab, neither quite ready to move forward into whatever came next. I'm only staying a few days, Audrey said, not looking at him. Maybe a week. I need to see if this is real, or just another thing you'll mess up. Preston absorbed the words, the limited commitment, the escape route she'd built into her plans. He couldn't blame her. That's fair, he said. They climbed out of the truck. Tucker bounded from the cab and immediately ran to the porch where Wendell had emerged, alerted by the sound of the engine. The old man smiled, raised a hand in greeting, but maintained his distance, understanding that this moment belonged to Preston and Audrey. Audrey studied the farmhouse, the barn, the garden visible beyond. Her expression remained guarded, but Preston saw her taking in details, the neatly tended beds, the solid barn roof, the care evident in small touches. You really live here, she said, as if the reality was just now settling in. I do. It's home now. Audrey turned to look at him fully. And you're happy. Actually happy, not just pretending. Preston met her gaze directly. I'm at peace in a way I've never been. The work is hard, but it matters. I feel useful. I feel like I'm building something real instead of just going through motions. Something flickered in Audrey's eyes. Not quite belief, but maybe the willingness to consider belief. Tucker barked from the porch, demanding attention. Audrey walked toward him, and the old dog danced with excitement, his entire body wiggling. She knelt down, and Tucker covered her face with kisses, his joy absolute and uncomplicated. Preston watched them together, and felt his eyes sting with tears he refused to let fall. This was the connection that had survived, Tucker's love for Audrey, her love for him. If Preston could rebuild even a fraction of that unconditional bond, they might have a chance. Wendell approached slowly, gave Audrey space, but offered a warm smile. You must be Audrey. Your father's told me a lot about you. I'm Wendell. Audrey stood, accepted his handshake. Thank you for... She paused, seemed unsure how to finish. For helping my dad. He helped himself, Wendell said kindly. I just gave him the place to do it. Welcome to the farm. I hope you'll be comfortable here. Wendell retreated to his cottage, understanding that Preston and Audrey needed space. Preston picked up her backpack, so light it broke his heart, and gestured toward the farmhouse. Let me show you your room. You can settle in, and then maybe we can walk around if you'd like. Audrey followed him inside. The farmhouse was cool and quiet, smelling of old wood and the coffee Preston had made that morning. He led her upstairs, opened the door to the guest room. Audrey stepped inside, stopped. Her eyes moved over everything. The quilt with its hundreds of stitched patches, the music box on the dresser catching afternoon light, the view through the window where sunflowers were visible, their green stalks reaching upward. She walked to the dresser, picked up the music box with hands that trembled slightly. She wound the key, and You Are My Sunshine began to play, each note slightly off-pitch but achingly familiar. You kept this, she said, her voice breaking. I've had it in my truck for 3 years, Preston admitted from the doorway. I never had the courage to send it to you. Never could let it go. Audrey turned to face him, tears streaming down her face now. I thought you'd thrown it away. When I left it in your truck that day, I came back looking for it, and it was gone. I thought you didn't care enough to save it. Preston's heart cracked. I cared too much to give it back. It was all I had left of you when you were small, before I ruined everything. They stood there, music box playing between them, years of misunderstanding laid bare. Audrey set the box down carefully, wiped her eyes. This room, she said, looking around again. You did all this for me. I wanted you to feel welcome. To know I remembered who you were, who we were together. Audrey walked to the window, looked down at the sunflowers. I loved sunflowers when I was little. I remember, Preston said softly. That's why I planted them there. So you'd see them every morning. Audrey pressed her hand to the glass, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. Preston wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but he stayed in the doorway, letting her have this moment of private emotion. Finally, she turned back to him. Her face was streaked with tears, but her expression had shifted. Some of the hardness softened, some of the walls lowered just slightly. I'm staying the week, she said. Maybe longer. We'll see. Preston nodded, not daring to hope too much, but feeling something bloom in his chest anyway. Thank you. That's more than I deserve. Yes, Audrey agreed bluntly. It is, but she said it without venom, just honesty. And in that honesty, Preston found the first real thread of connection, fragile but there. Audrey unpacked her small backpack, so little for even a few days, while Preston waited downstairs, giving her space. When she emerged 20 minutes later, her face was washed clean of tears, her expression carefully composed again. Would you like to see the property? Preston offered. Or we could just sit on the porch. Whatever you prefer. Let's walk, Audrey said. I've been sitting on planes and in airports all morning. They walked the garden first, Tucker trailing between them like a furry ambassador of peace. Preston pointed out the beds he'd planted. Tomatoes, still small, bean shoots climbing their trellises, squash spreading their broad leaves. He kept his explanations simple, not lecturing, just sharing what he'd learned. Audrey noticed the wildflowers beginning to bloom at the garden's edge. These are pretty. I planted them thinking of the view from your window, Preston admitted. Wanted you to have something colourful to look at. Audrey glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression, then continued walking. They moved to the orchard, where apple trees wore their spring buds like promises. Preston explained how Wendell had taught him grafting, how you could join two living things to create something better than either alone. Is that a metaphor? Audrey asked, a hint of her old sharpness returning. Preston smiled slightly. Wendell's full of those, but yes, I suppose it is. You can't force things to grow, you just create the right conditions and trust the process. They walked in silence through the rows of trees, sunlight filtering through branches that would soon be heavy with leaves. The peace of the place was palpable. No traffic sounds, no sirens, just birdsong and wind and the soft crunch of their footsteps on grass. At the barn, Audrey studied the new roof. You did this? With help from neighbors, Preston said. Virgil, Dwayne, a few others, taught me something about accepting help, about community. I've spent most of my life trying to do everything alone. That's true, Audrey said quietly. You never asked for help. Even when Mum begged you to talk to someone during the divorce, you refused. Too proud. Preston accepted the observation without defense. I was. I thought asking for help meant admitting failure. I know better now. They visited the chickens, which made Audrey laugh, actually laugh, when they swarmed around her feet, hoping for treats. Preston showed her how to scatter feed, and for a few moments she was simply present, delighted by the birds' antics, her guard lowered by their simple enthusiasm. Lunch was sandwiches on the porch, nothing fancy. Wendell joined them, his presence easing some of the tension. He asked Audrey about Seattle, her design work, her life there. She answered more freely with him than she had with Preston, and Preston was grateful for the older man's gentle facilitation. After lunch, Audrey admitted she was tired from travel. She retreated to her room for a nap, and Preston forced himself not to hover, not to check on her every few minutes. He sat on the porch with Wendell instead. She's here, Wendell observed. That's already more than you had yesterday. I'm terrified of saying the wrong thing, Preston confessed. Of pushing too hard or not hard enough. Then stop calculating, Wendell advised. Just be with her. Listen when she talks. Give her space when she needs it. The relationship will find its own pace if you stop trying to control it. That evening, Audrey emerged from her room looking rested. They made dinner together, pasta with vegetables from last year's garden that Wendell had preserved. Working side by side in the kitchen felt both familiar and strange. echoes of years ago when she'd helped him cook Sunday dinners. Over the meal, Audrey finally asked the question Preston had been dreading. "Why were you so cruel about Travis?" "About my engagement." Preston set down his fork, met her eyes directly. "Because I was scared. I saw him hurting you. The way he isolated you from friends, the way he criticized everything you did, and I knew you couldn't see it yet. I wanted to protect you." "But you didn't protect me," Audrey said, her voice tight with old pain. "You attacked my judgment. You made me feel stupid and naive." "I know," Preston said, his voice breaking. "And I was wrong. Even if I was right about him, I was completely wrong in how I handled it. I should have trusted you to figure it out on your own timeline. I should have offered support instead of criticism." "And then when it ended," Audrey continued, tears forming, "when he'd done everything you predicted and I finally found the strength to leave him, you said, 'I told you so.' Do you know how that felt?" Preston's own eyes filled. "I can't imagine. You needed your father to comfort you, and instead I gave you smugness. I prioritized being right over your pain. It was cruel, and I'm so deeply sorry." Audrey wiped her eyes roughly. "You were my dad. You were supposed to help me heal, not make me feel worse about my own terrible choices." Preston reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "I failed you completely, and I can't take back those words or undo that hurt. But I want to be better. I want to be the father you deserved then and deserve now." They sat in heavy silence, 3 years of hurt laid bare between them. Tucker, sensing the emotion, whined softly and pressed against Audrey's leg. "I don't know if I can trust you again," Audrey whispered. "Then don't," Preston said. "Not yet. Just let me show you day by day that I've learned. That I can listen without judging, support without controlling, love without conditions." Audrey looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for sincerity or performance. Whatever she saw there made something in her expression shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the willingness to believe change was possible. They cleared dishes together in silence, the kitchen filling with the comfortable sounds of running water and clinking plates. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something, a shared task, a moment of peaceful coexistence. As twilight deepened, Preston had an idea. "Come outside. I want to show you something." They walked into the field behind the house, where fireflies were beginning to emerge, their lights pulsing softly in the gathering darkness. Preston retrieved an old jar from the barn, handed it to Audrey. "Remember doing this?" he asked. Audrey's face transformed with memory. "You let me stay up late to catch them. We'd fill jars and watch them glow. And then we'd release them before bed," Preston added. "You always insisted they needed to be free." They began catching fireflies, clumsy at first, then finding their rhythm. The jar filled with soft, pulsing light, and Audrey's laughter, tentative at first, then more genuine, filled the space between them. They sat on the porch steps, the jar between them, watching the captured lights dance. "I forgot we used to do this," Audrey said softly. "I didn't," Preston admitted. "I thought about it a lot over the past 3 years. All the small moments I took for granted. All the times I should have just been present instead of distracted by work or stress or my own problems." Audrey studied the jar, her face illuminated by firefly light. "Why didn't you call me? After our fight, why didn't you keep trying?" "Pride," Preston said honestly. "Fear. Shame. I told myself you needed space, but really I was just protecting myself from more rejection. I was a coward. I wanted you to call," Audrey admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even though I was angry, even though I'd blocked your number, I kept hoping you'd find a way. I needed to know you cared more about our relationship than about your pride." The words hit Preston like physical blows. "I'm so sorry. I should have tried harder. I should have fought for you instead of just accepting the distance." They sat in silence, watching the fireflies glow and dim, glow and dim. Finally, Audrey spoke. "I'm staying the week, maybe longer if..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "If we can keep talking like this, honestly, without you getting defensive or trying to fix everything." Preston nodded, not trusting his voice. After a moment he managed, "I'd like that, more than anything." Together they opened the jar and released the fireflies, watching them disperse into the darkness, their lights growing fainter until they disappeared completely. It felt symbolic, letting go of what needed to be free, trusting that beauty didn't require capture or control. They sat on the porch steps, Tucker between them, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence felt less like absence and more like peace. Not healed, not yet, not whole, but healing, becoming whole, one careful stitch at a time. The night deepened around them, and Preston felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope that wasn't desperate or grasping, but quiet and patient. Hope that understood healing took time, that trust rebuilt slowly, that the best things grew not from perfect conditions, but from consistent care. Audrey rested her head on Tucker's back, her hand finding Preston's in the darkness. She didn't squeeze, didn't hold tightly, just touched, a tentative connection testing whether contact was safe. Preston held perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. And there in the darkness, with fireflies dancing in distant fields and his daughter's hand barely touching his, he felt the first real stirring of forgiveness, not given, not yet, but possible. 5 days passed like water over stone, gentle, persistent, gradually wearing down the hard edges between them. Preston woke each morning to find Audrey already on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the farm come to life. They'd sit together in comfortable silence. Tucker sprawled between their chairs, and Preston would feel grateful for these small moments of shared peace. They worked the garden together, weeding, watering, harvesting early lettuce that Audrey exclaimed over, surprised by how much better it tasted fresh from the soil. She proved capable with her hands, enjoyed the physical work in ways that seemed to surprise her. Preston watched her relax into the rhythm of farm life, saw tension leaving her shoulders day by day. Wendell joined them for dinner each evening, fully recovered now, his presence a steady anchor. He told stories about Margaret, about learning life's lessons slowly, and sometimes too late. One night, Audrey asked him directly, "Do you think people can really change?" Wendell looked at Preston with something like pride. "I think pain can teach us if we let it. Your father let it. He came here broken and did the hard work of putting himself back together. That's not nothing." The conversations between Preston and Audrey deepened as the days accumulated. She told him about Seattle, about her design work, about the small apartment where she lived alone. She admitted feeling lonely there, isolated in ways she hadn't fully recognized until coming here. "I thought independence meant being alone," she confessed one afternoon while they repaired a section of fence. "That needing people was weakness." "I thought the same thing," Preston replied, holding a post steady while she tightened wire. "But I was wrong. Real strength is choosing connection even when it's scary, even when you might get hurt." One afternoon they drove into Crestwood together. Preston introduced Audrey to Virgil and Dwayne, to the community that had welcomed him. They were warm to her, genuinely glad to meet her, and Audrey seemed surprised by how they spoke of Preston, with respect, with affection, as one of their own. At the diner over coffee, Audrey said quietly, "You're different here, softer, more present." "I'm different everywhere now," Preston said. "This place just helped me see it, helped me understand what matters." "Do you think you can stay this way?" Audrey asked, her eyes searching his face. "Or will you go back to who you were?" Preston considered the question carefully, understanding its weight. "I'll have bad days. I'll make mistakes, but I won't go back to being the man who valued being right over being kind. That man nearly destroyed everything that mattered. I won't let him return." Audrey studied him for a long moment. "I want to believe that." "Then watch me," Preston said simply. "As long as you need to." The sunflowers grew rapidly, their stalks thickening, their leaves spreading wide. Each morning Audrey would look out her window at them, and Preston would see her smile, small at first, then more genuine as the days passed. One evening, Wendell appeared with his camera, asked if he could photograph them. Preston and Audrey stood side by side in the garden, hands dirty from the day's work, and Wendell captured it. Father and daughter, reconciliation made visible in shared labor and tentative smiles. Later, Wendell had the photo printed and framed, presented it to Preston with simple ceremony. "For the mantle. So you remember this moment when things get hard?" Preston placed it there immediately, and Audrey stood looking at it for a long time, something working in her expression that might have been hope. 2 days before Audrey's scheduled departure, she made an announcement over breakfast that stopped Preston's heart. "I'm not going back to Seattle," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. I'm going back to pack up my apartment and settle things. But then I'm coming here, if that's okay." Preston could barely breathe. "You want to move here?" "To the farm?" Audrey nodded, meeting his eyes. "My job is remote anyway, and her voice caught. "I don't want to lose you again. Not when we're finally finding our way back." Preston's vision blurred with tears. "You could never lose me. I'm here always, for as long as you'll let me be." They embraced then, fully, warmly, the stiffness that had marked their reunion completely gone. Audrey cried into his shoulder, and Preston held her the way he had when she was small, protective and gentle, and grateful beyond words. "I forgive you, Dad," Audrey whispered. "I forgive you." Preston's own tears fell freely. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me this chance." Tucker barked, pushed between them, and they laughed through their tears, including him in their embrace. Wendell appeared on the porch, saw them, understood immediately. He smiled quietly and retreated, giving them their moment. The final 2 days transformed, lighter, filled with planning and possibility. They discussed Audrey's move. She'd take the guest room permanently. They'd convert part of the barn into a workspace for her design projects. They talked about expanding the garden, maybe getting chickens of their own, building something together rather than Preston simply showing her what he'd built alone. Audrey suggested renaming the farm Ashby Callaway Farm, honoring the legacy while claiming their shared future. Preston loved the idea immediately, felt its rightness in his bones. The morning Preston drove Audrey to the airport, not goodbye but see you soon, felt entirely different from her arrival. She carried the same small backpack, but now it was accompanied by plans, by promises, by the weight of commitment rather than escape routes. "I'll be back in 3 weeks, Audrey said as they stood at departures. "With all my stuff, my whole life, basically. I'll have your room ready," Preston promised. "And the sunflowers will be even taller." They embraced without stiffness, without fear. "I love you, Dad," Audrey said, the words coming easily now, naturally. Preston's heart felt too full for his chest. "I love you too, sweetheart. Always have, always will." He watched her walk into the terminal, and she turned back once to wave. Preston waved back, standing there until she disappeared from sight, his face wet with tears that felt like relief, like joy, like the breaking open of something long sealed shut. Driving home, Preston felt peace settle over him, like Wendell's quilt, made of many pieces stitched together with patient care, warm and whole. The farm appeared ahead, the new sign they'd ordered visible at the entrance. Ashby Callaway Farm. Tucker greeted him enthusiastically when he arrived, and together they walked to Wendell's cottage. The old man was on his porch, rocking gently, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "She's coming back," Preston said, sitting beside him. "To stay, I know," Wendell replied. "I saw it in her face days ago. She'd found what she needed here." "Thank you," Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. The farm, the wisdom, the second chance at life." "You earned it," Wendell said firmly. "You did the work, on the land and on yourself. That's all any of us can do." They sat in comfortable silence. 2 men who'd found unexpected friendship in shared struggle and growth. Preston looked out. At the farm, the garden thriving, the barn sturdy, the farmhouse waiting to become truly home. The sunflowers swayed in the breeze, their faces turned toward the sun, growing taller each day. In 3 weeks, they'd be magnificent, a golden welcome for Audrey's return. Preston thought about the music box, about the fireflies, about the photograph on the mantel capturing a moment of healing. He thought about the quilt upstairs, hundreds of broken pieces stitched into wholeness, and understood finally what Margaret had been teaching through her art. Nothing stays broken unless you choose to leave it that way. Everything can be mended if you're willing to do the patient work of repair. Love isn't about perfection. It's about presence, about showing up honestly, about giving people room to grow while growing alongside them. The miracle hadn't been the farm gifted by a kind old man, though Preston would be grateful for that forever. The miracle was what had grown from it. A father and daughter finding their way back to each other, trust rebuilt one careful stitch at a time, forgiveness offered and received not as a single moment, but as a daily practice of choosing connection over pride. Preston closed his eyes, felt the sun on his face, Tucker's weight against his leg, Wendell's quiet companionship beside him. Everything broken was being made whole again. The farm hummed with life and possibility, with seeds planted and tended, with things growing toward light. And it was more than enough. It was everything. 3 weeks later, when Audrey's car pulled up the drive, loaded with her belongings, Preston was waiting on the porch. The sunflowers had grown to 5 feet tall, their golden faces bright against the blue sky. Tucker barked joyfully, racing to greet her. Audrey stepped out, looked at the sunflowers, at the new sign, at her father waiting with open arms and an open heart. She smiled, fully, freely, without reservation, and walked home. Preston embraced, his daughter in the place that had saved them both, and somewhere above them, the leaves of the apple trees rustled in the breeze, making sounds like applause, like blessing, like the universe acknowledging that sometimes, against all odds, broken, things really do become whole again. The farm stretched around them, patient and enduring, witness to transformation, home to second chances, proof that the real miracle was never the gift itself, but what you chose to grow from it. And they were growing. Together, finally, toward light.